In today's video, we're going to be looking at the introduction to the following unit, collection of objects. This is going to be a symbolic self-portrait where you are going to be asked to collect items from around your house, arrange them into a still life, and complete a graphite drawing. On the screen are some examples of ones from last year. So we have someone who was interested in music, and they've included some sheet music, flowers associated with the title of the music, and also laid out on a keyboard as the backdrop. The second one, we have a example of somebody who was interested in art. So they've included some pencils, some coffee, and also their love of reading. So they included some glasses. The third one is an example of somebody who is interested in sewing. So they've included a bobbin, a thimble, sewing needles, and some pins. In this next slide are some more examples of work from last year. So we have examples of somebody who was highly interested again in music. We have somebody who was interested in art, somebody who was interested in different types of art up here. So they've included clay sculpture tools, drawing tools, as well as scissors and a pencil sharpener. To add a level of advanced drawing skills, they've also included a silver platter where they have a reflection of the supplies being cast onto the silver platter. So that was just to make it a little bit more challenging for the student to create the drawing. In the upper example, we have a piece where the student was interested in, again, a lot of different types of art making. So they've included pencils, crafting supplies like wire and jewelry, a paintbrush, and they've also included a plant because they were interested in gardening as well. The bottom example might be partially obscured, but it was an example where the student was interested in nature. So they've included a pine cone, a jawbone of an animal, and a fern. So there are many objectives with this unit that we're going to be reviewing from previous experiences with your drawing skills. This is going to help remind you of some basics and also to push you to think about composition strategies and what to include in a composition more deeply. So for objectives, the number one is to compose a collection of 3 to 7 objects that have personal significance for you. They can reflect some of your interests. They could reflect things that you cherish. They're going to create a symbolic self-portrait. The second objective is to review compositional strategies. There's going to be a slide coming up where we look at some of the different compositional strategies that really break down a composition into basic shapes. To review some of the process that an artist would go through when making a composition, we're going to be creating 3 thumbnail sketches. And those are really just rough sketches that plan out where things are going to go before you commit to a lot of detail. In the long run, they save you a lot of time because you're not working on something to a degree of finished level and then deciding that it's not a good composition. So a thumbnail sketch really helps you to work out in advance what's going to work and what's not going to work. For this project, we're going to be using a variety of pencil hardness. So we're going to be using H pencils, the very hard ones that give you a nice crisp line, all the way to 6B, which are almost more like charcoal in that they are very chalky and they smudge really easily and you get some really rich dark tones. That will help us to get a wide range of value. When you're thinking about your composition, it's important to include shadows or to think about your shadows and how lighting is going to affect your still life. So we'll be highlighting that in a later slide. So effective composition can be determined by a lot of different formula. You can think about the rule of thirds, you could think about the golden ratio. For this particular project, we're going to be breaking it down into basic composition shapes. So when you have a lot of objects laid out on a piece of fabric or on a table, it's a good idea to think about how they are connected to one another. So in these 2 examples, where seeing some contrast of values because we have some light and dark objects. We have some contrast because we have some shadow happening on the fabric. And then also the dark objects against a light fabric is giving us some contrast. And then lighting is providing us with some shadows, mainly on the fabric and underneath the objects, because it looks like on both of these, the light is coming from above and traveling to the tops of the objects and casting a shadow underneath. So these are our basic choices for a composition formula. These are just the basic shapes that you might encounter when looking at artwork that is arranged so that it is easy to focus on the individual objects. So a triangle is the most common example of a shape that you'll find in a composition for still life. It gives you a sense of hierarchy, and it leads the eye from one object up to the central object and then down to the final object. When looking at artwork, typically we look at artwork so that we're reading it from right to left, because that's how we read text. And to do the kind of decoding that our brain follows through, it goes through those same stages. So thinking about your composition in terms of what someone is going to see first, second, third, and so on, breaks it down into these kind of basic shapes. So the triangle here, we would first see the lemon. It would rise up to the tall bottle. We would have some incidental objects helping to create the side of the triangle and leading our eye down to the plate. Verticals and horizontals are another strategy where you're looking at creating converging lines, and they're happening at 90-degree angles. So we have an example of a tall shape giving us some height. That's the first thing we would encounter because it's on the left side, and our eyes moving towards the right side. And we would next encounter a sphere, and then the next shape would give us that horizontal feel. So having a mixture of both tall vertical elements and horizontal elements gives you that combination of having a cross or an intersection. Converging diagonals are going to give you a more interesting still life in terms of your eye kind of working its way through different levels that are tilted. So with the example here, we have the fruit bowl, which our eye is reading as a vertical. It's then going to the glass, which is again a vertical. The paper plane intersecting with the stapler and kind of meeting at an angle like this is really giving you an interesting focus where those two are kind of coming together, and you're going to really highlight their intersection. So they've also got a great cast shadow happening there. The final shape that we're going to be looking at in terms of composition is an S shape or a curve. For this, your eye is traveling on a path, and it's starting again on the left. So in this case, with the set of car keys, it's following through from the yellow car, going all the way to the orange and up to the bowl of flowers, and then the flower on the table is kind of completing the S. For this, you're looking at having your eye start in one place and then kind of journey somewhere else. So those are your choices in terms of picking how you want to arrange your objects. Again, a triangle is the most common one that artists will select for a still life. When you're arranging your objects, we're going to be photographing them because this is a multi-day project. So you need to think about your eye level and the angle at which you're photographing your work. If you're above your work and looking down at it, you're going to get more variety of shapes and overlap than if you were looking at it head on and you were looking at it just on a table level. So you want to make sure that you're changing your height as you photograph your still life. So when you're photographing your still life, you also want to think about lighting because it affects how your shadows are being cast. So if you have a hard light coming in from one side through a window, or if you're doing this at night, maybe you have a lamp positioned so that light is coming from one side and casting a shadow, then you're going to end up with a strong shadow. In the example of the pears, more uh, we're having more difference of intensity with the shadow. So you're having a strong highlight in all three, but the ambient light in the background is changing. So you're getting a difference of saturation and that intensity of contrast. So some examples based on themes that you might start to think about what objects you'd like to arrange for your still life. Somebody who is interested in art might decide that they really want to focus on photography, and they get out their tripod, their camera, and they kind of work the cord or the camera strap so that it's creating this kind of curving line. The second one is looking at more of a top-down view. So you have an interesting shape happening with the two cylinders for the jar and also um, the glass that's holding the paintbrushes. These people selected music as their theme, so they've included instruments. If you're somebody that likes to build things and work with your hands, you might go into your shed or garage, gather together some hand tools and supplies that you can arrange in interesting angles. If you really want to challenge yourself with this, you might consider including a glass object so that you have an interesting highlight being cast onto the surface, not only a shadow. This person selected, well, these people selected the theme of books. So they have a still life setup with a triangular composition here, versus this one is including mostly horizontals, but then it has a converging angle happening with this book going back into space. These two people were interested in science, and this person used a textbook as their background instead of using a piece of fabric. The theme of a beach, this person is using a collection of sea glass, seashells, a note that's been crumpled up to add an interesting texture. And on the more zoomed in version of the seashells, you have a really direct highlight on the top side, and then you have a really strong cast shadow. If you're somebody who's interested in environmentalism or recycling, you might arrange some trash in an interesting way and create a composition based on those objects. If you're somebody who likes to cook, these are really simple studies of how metallic flatware receives shadow and highlight from nearby objects. Or you might have a collection of things that don't relate to one another that you treasure. So you don't necessarily have to have a single theme for your self-portrait. It could be that you have a lot of different interests and you collect a lot of different things that are then included. In this one, we have an example on the left where the person is including a miniature self-portrait by including a reflective mirror. And they've also kind of captured a space by having the bathroom sink and the shaving bag. On the right is more of a focused still life with mostly dance-related objects, but then including some paintbrushes and a palette as well. Finally, we have a piece by MC Escher on the left. So we have a hyper glossy kind of bottle, which is giving another kind of avenue to have a self-portrait included. You can see the kind of distortion of the room that's happening in the reflective surface. But he's also included some knickknacks and a book and his glasses. And then finally, we have somebody who is interested in more like motorsports or skiing. So we've got the pair of goggles. So steps for this project are pretty straightforward. We're going to assemble a still life of 3 to 7 objects. Keep in mind whatever interests you have or what objects you would like to include. Because this is a multi-day drawing, we're going to photograph your setup, being conscious of lighting and shadows. So to photograph your still life, we're going to be setting that up in a separate tutorial, walking you step by step, and then taking your pictures. After you've selected many photographs to choose from, we're going to choose 3 of those photographs and kind of narrow it down to those 3 to make into thumbnail sketches. So the thumbnail sketches we're going to crop to make different compositions, keeping in mind those kind of basic shapes from the composition strategies. One of those thumbnail sketches is then going to become your final drawing, and we're going to be drawing that on large paper, trying to keep your thumbnail composition as true as you can from the thumbnail into the final version. A lot of times people will create a thumbnail sketch, the composition will be really strong, and then they'll go to do the final and they'll kind of throw out their composition because they're not enlarging objects to the scale that they need to be. So we want to try to avoid that when we're making our final piece. As an option, you can create a value finder. There's a slide coming up that goes over how to do that using H through 6B pencils, and it just really allows you to see what the pencils are capable of when it comes to adding your value. So the thumbnail sketches are going to be the mini compositions that are going to kind of work out problems before you get into details. There's a video I've included here from Lacree Fine Art. It's a great YouTube video that goes over how to create one of these value finders that you can see here. And it's really just a case of taking a scrap piece of paper, scribbling with a light hand using each of the pencils just to see what kind of values you can get from that pencil, and then using a hole puncher and just punching a hole right in the middle so that you can hold it up to your reference photo if you print it black and white, and you can kind of match from the reference photo to the correct pencil to use for that area. All right, so that is it for this introductory PowerPoint. I know that's a lot of information in one go, but you can scroll through this at your own pace. I will include the full PowerPoint as well as this Screencastify.